right, now that we've seen the common patterns to look for in our use scenarios, let's look at common patterns in our extended use scenarios or in our system. So I'm going to open this up really quickly and we're going to look at some of these interaction patterns. So in our extended use scenarios, we're going to be making calls between classes, and we're going to see these patterns. So we have class name 1 calls class name 2 method. So we're going to be making calls to say we want to see our room, okay, or see a room, see an individual room. We're going to be calling that room to get that information, right? So we would say the user interface calls room get room, and that's going to deliver to us all of the data within our room. So that's where we can kind of see our first pattern. So class name 1, that was our user interface, calls class name 2, then we have our method. So user interface calls room get room, and that delivers all of our, that should return all of our data from the room. So then we see this next pattern, or this next line, class name 2, which was our room, returns what? Returns some data to class name 1 user interface. Okay, so what are they returning? They're returning, that room is returning the details, the room details to our user interface. The next pattern we're going to see is a nested pattern. So we have class name 1 calls class name 2 method, and sometimes there's going to be another interaction that we're going to see. Once class name 1 calls class name 2, that means that class name 2 is going to get something from class name 3. So we have class name 1 calls class name 2 calls class name 3, and then we're going to see that same pattern in our returns. So class name 3 returns something to class name 2, class name 2 then returns something to class name 1. We want to see that return pattern as well. So if the pattern is there with our call, it should mostly be there with our return. So let's take a look at our hotel booking system extended use scenarios, completed ones, and take a look at these patterns. So here, let's jump down actually to this next one, because this one does not count for different reasons, and we'll see why. So we have customer calls user interface display. So class name 1 calls class name 2 display. A class name 2 user interface calls user list add user. So you see we're using those patterns. User list calls customer constructor. Customer calls payment method constructor. And now we see we've nested it all the way down, and now we're going to start returning data. Payment method returns new payment method to customer. Notice we're calling that, or we're returning the data to the class that called it. Customer returns new customer object to user list. Again, user list had called customer constructor, so that's where we want to return it. User list returns success signal to user interface, and user interface returns homepage view to customer. Depending on whatever it is that we're trying to get, that's how we know what we're going to be returning. So for example, here we have the user interface displaying the homepage view. Well, how do I know that that's what I want to display? How do I know that that's going to be the attribute that I put in? Well, let's look down and see what the customer is going to see after they click create account. So they're going to click create account and they're going to see the homepage. So I have a homepage view, and it's a layout as the parameter here. Well, then the user interface calls user list. Well, why are we calling user list? Because we're wanting to create an account. So we need to add an account. And how do we add an account to the user list? Well, we add user. And how do I know what the parameter is going to be in my add user method call? Well, I just filled out a form, so I'm going to put all my user input. Now you see, whenever the input is a lot, such as this situation, we have several parameters, I just put user input. When it has 1 or 2 parameters, maybe 3, I will list those out. So here we say user list calls customer constructor. Let's back up for a second. User list calls customer constructor. This one here, user list. So interface calls user list add user. So then add user is going to, or user list is going to call the customer class, right? This is an inheritance class. So we wouldn't call user, we would call the class that we're trying to create, customers, and then we're going to call their constructor. And like I mentioned before, we don't have constructor listed as a method here, but it is there. We know that every class has to have a constructor. And add users right there. So make sure that your methods are within the system before using them. And I want to wrap this up because I don't want this video to be too long. So user list calls customer constructor. Here's an example of only using 2 attributes. So customer calls pay method card number and expiration date. Then it's going to return that object to the customer. Why are we returning pay method object to customer? Because a customer has a pay method.